the assertion of dignity in the formal sector industry in India. Welcome learners, I am happy to welcome you back to the final session on the topic industry and labour. In the previous session, we studied in detail about the social life and the lifestyle of the labourer. We shall start this session from what is dignity and how the dignity of the labour is explained in industry and how it is asserted in the Indian factories. The objective of this session is to explain about the assertion of dignity, schemes for the labour, role of trade unions. What is dignity? We can identify a thin version of dignity which originates from Latin notion of worthiness to describe something concrete achieved in terms of respect and status. Yet, the word also suggests something more significant, something that we can acknowledge when lost, the negation of dignity. It implies a process of reduction, degradation or dehumanization. This is captured both by religious and secular humanist appreciation of intrinsic human worth and acceptable moral standards. In this sense, dignity has real significance across a variety of spiritual, ethical and human rights traditions. The dignity of labour. The dignity of labour can also be understood in terms of worthiness and status, that all type of jobs be respected equally and no occupation considered superior in terms of awarding esteem and reward. Yet, within Christian ethics and specifically Catholic social teaching, the dignity of labour stretches beyond such a thin usage. On May 15, 1891, Pope Leo XIII published Rerum Novarum in the Latin meaning of revolutionary change on the right and duties of capital and labour. It remains an extraordinary condemnation of industrial capitalism and the immiseration of the working class. It asserts the moral imperative to regulate capitalism and established a preferential option for the poor in the evolution of Catholic thought. This creed advocated unions, collective bargaining and a living wage to maintain a respect, the dignity of a person in the workplace, created in the image of God. It urged the capitalist not to look upon their work people as their bondsmen, but to respect in every man his dignity as a person ennobled by the Christian character. The text asserts that labour takes precedence over capital and the need for work protection to halt the violation of dignity, including unemployment, wage inequalities, job insecurities and technological change, the last of which can supplant the person, taking away all personal satisfaction and the incentive to creativity and responsibility. When it deprives many workers of their previous employment, or when through exalting the machine it reduces man the status of its slave. Work is spiritual activity, following in the footsteps of a carpenter, through which man collaborates for the redemption of humanity. Dignity is not just about status, worthiness in a job hierarchy. It is also about something we acknowledge when lost. It implies intrinsic human worth and acceptable moral standard in terms of rights, freedoms and obligations in the ways people live and work together. These are questions of justice. They suggest ethical duties in how we order society. In tolerating forms of death, punishment, slavery, abuse, and exploitation, we compromise both our personal and collective dignity. The assertion of dignity among the factory workers what further marks factory workers in regular employment out as a special category in that they have amalgamated into trade unions to negotiate improvements in their work condition and to defend their rights. In both, the state has also played an important role. The labour legislation introduced after independence has operated primarily, if not exclusively, to the benefit of this segment of the working class. Nor should it be imagined that the protection by pure benevolence. It was a concession to the power built up by the factorized proletariat and the inevitable consequence of the commanding role which the state had assumed in managing and the transition to an industrial order in which these workers were considered so vital. At stake in the discussions of the National Planning Committee in 1940 was the creation of an industrial machinery like that which already existed in Europe. Coupled with this was the introduction of extensive legislation on condition of employment, including the delimitation of the working week, prohibition of the child labour, provisions for sanitation, health and safety at work, the fixing and implementation of a minimum wage, equal pay for equal work, the right to a paid vacation, maternity benefits, housing quarters, procedures for settling conflicts and compulsory arbitration by government, necessitating the establishment of a conciliation board and an industrial court. Schemes for the labour. The creation of a system of social security was also discussed. A system of compulsory and contributory social insurance for the industrial worker should be established directly under the control of the state to cover the risk of sickness and invalidity other than those covered by the Workmen's Compensation Act. Schemes for providing alternative employment to those involuntary unemployed, old age pensions and survivors' pensions, and also social insurance to cover the risk of sickness and invalidity for all should be established directly under the state. These schemes should be extended by stages, priority being given to a particular classes of workers with due regard to the relative urgency of their needs, facility of application and to the ability of the community to provide them. During the deliberations, however, Ambalal Sarabhai, president of the Ahmedabad Mill Owners Association, who acted as the employer's representative, asked whether it was really intended that the entire package should be introduced in the short term. The chairman Jawaharlal Nehru explained that it represented a coordinated scheme which did not allow for piecemeal selection, but was vague about the timing of its implementation, which would anyway have to wait until after the transfer of the power. The nationalist leadership realized that the mobilization of industrial workers, which had started in the colonial era and had expressed itself in strikes and other forms of protest, might gain new impetus after the liberation from alien rule, and therefore recognized the need to pacify labour. In 1929, the number of registered trade unions in India was 29. In 1951, it was 3,987. Economic policy obviously had to come to terms with this institutionalized interest. Although the unions cared for the interest of a only tiny minority of the laboring classes, that minority formed its most vocal and most militant segment. The hope was that in exchange for special treatment, this vanguard of the dangerous classes might be induced to abandon more extreme demands. Peasants and workers were ad nauseum told to sacrifice their own interest for the good of the nation. One member of the National Planning Committee suggested that there should be no room for the industrial unrest in the planned economy, but fear of the radicalization of the factory proletariat, whose numbers were bound to increase rapidly, was nevertheless great. Faced with this threat, the politicians adopted various strategies. First, they successfully encouraged the rise of trade unions that were linked to different political currents and whose mutual rivalry prevented the labor movement from forming a united front. Second, every effort was made to avoid or diffuse direct confrontation between employers and employees. The priority given with the harmony and reconciliation with arbitration prescribed meant that the state itself became a principal party to negotiations. Third, through the carrot of benefits and facilities, they sought to detach the industrial elite from its links with the far greater mass of workers. This enormous army of underprivileged labor was excluded from formal wage negotiations, and there was no institutionalized mechanism for the promotion of their interest. A Fair Wages Committee was given the task of finding out how much an industrial worker needed to provide for himself and his immediate family, significantly identified as a unit of man, wife and 2 children. Not merely the bare essentials of food, clothing and shelter, but a measure of frugal comfort including education for the children, protection against ill health, requirements of essential social needs and a measure of insurance against the more inevitable misfortunes including old age. The employers argued, however, that even a measure of frugal comfort was too heavy a burden and that they could only grant a fair wage if labor would agree to increase production and maintain industrial peace. This was not unattractive in that the wage set was far above that on which the greater part of the working population had to survive. Until the beginning of the 1960s, the illusion was maintained that industrialization would be instrumental in the transition towards the socialist society. In addition to a fair wage and bonus policy and the acceptance of collective bargaining, industrial socialism would also mean workers' participation in management and eventually profit sharing. But this of course was never achieved nor even seriously attempted. The class consciousness of the factory workers is demonstrated by their willingness to organize, and union membership is conventionally taken as evidence of their readiness for collective action and as an index of their solidarity. In fact, by no means all workers in the formal sector became union members. Even on the grossly inflated membership figures provided by the unions themselves, less than 1 out of 3 workers were registered, and if the regular payment of the union dues is the hard stick, the proportion shrinks much further. The hardcore of the trade unionist is actually a small minority, and as we have seen, this vanguard of working class shows no inclination to join the struggle for improving the plight of the non-organized masses. Evaluation of this rather pessimistic picture must be on the basis of empirical research on the relation between the workers and the unions. The best study undoubtedly remains that of E. A. Ramasamy, already more than 2 decades old. This showed that Coimbatore mill workers keep a sharp eye on whether the union's cadre exert themselves in caring for their concerns, but are also acutely aware that their existence is far more comfortable than that of the great mass of the workers who have no one to defend their interest. As one senior member remarked, there is a limit to what we can ask from the mill owner. He gets 4 times as much his neighbor who toils in the field all day, and yet his job is easier and not very much more skilled than the other. Unless conditions improve all around, it is difficult to get us to ask for more. Despite Ramasamy's, the worker and his trade union membership includes women. Hastening away at the end of their shift to do their household chores, they are said to be generally quite passive in the union affairs and to do no more than pay their contributions. But if their jobs are endangered or if other problems arises, they are extremely militant. At the time of the research, they had every reason to assert themselves because women were particularly threatened by redundancy. We have earlier seen that women are concentrated in the lowest ranks of the labor hierarchy and often get no further than casual work. Whatever their sex, casual workers have greater needs than regular workers of the help and protection of a union. Not only is their unionization opposed by the employers, but union leaders show little zest for and even some hostility toward them. Can they be blamed? Holmstrom takes a charitable view, pointing out that consolidating their gains is difficult enough without having to defend the interests of a mass of workers who are far more vulnerable, even more than the badlies who have at least been able to join the pool of the reserve labor to avoid their turn for a job. That vulnerability afflicts the infinitely greater mass of who have not yet found their way into the awaiting room. Role of the trade unions. Many unions are overwhelmingly defensive. They are there to protect jobs first, then the real value of wages against the inflation with safety and working conditions a poor third rather than to win more than the members have already. They know their bargaining power is weak, noisy, militant, demands for more are tactic to hold the line, something to be bargained away when vital interests are threatened. The union has a hard enough job protecting its own member without worrying about outsiders. Other authors like Mamkutan in 1982 are far more critical. The leaders are manipulative and corrupt, more concerned with their own interest than in caring for those of the rank and file. Workers react by making their support for them contingent on the result they achieve. If these are disappointing, they have no hesitation in defecting to a rival union. It is not a question of ideology, but a pragmatic choice of who offers the most for the lowest price. According to such authors, trade union bosses operate as brokers like the earlier jobbers and use their mandate to enter into the deals with employers, politicians and rival unions. It is perhaps not surprising that unionization of the factorized workforce remains quite limited. The battles which had to be fought in order to break through the employers' resistance to the formation of unions and to the first collective actions is perhaps the principal reason why the present generation of factory workers have any faith in these organizations. The memory of champions in the fight for a better life who often had to pay a high price for their ideals and dedication still lives on. Sheth, who concluded that the union had only marginal significance for the workforce he studied, nevertheless added the qualification that workers realized that though the union achieved precise little for them, they could achieve even less. Workers realized that though the union achieved precious little for them, they could achieve even less in the absence of a union. Individual workers could make a comparison in retrospect between union days and unionless days and found that though the union got them hardly anywhere in relation to the demands it made on the management, it was necessary for systematic dealing with the management. This seems to be a common view amongst the organized labor whose lack of more embracing came to the sense of solidarity, who see less as a product of a short-sighted aristocratic mentality than as a quite realistic fear that the cake may be too small for all comers. In the view of Jan Bremen, however, the Indian trade union movement has played an emancipatory role. Perlin is quite correct in pointing out that little if any improvement has been brought about in the more deplorable working conditions. In a great many enterprises, these are injurious not only to health but also to human dignity. The complacent opinion of the NCL report that industrial workers became inured to such hardships and can more or less ignore them fails to grasp the sense of resentment, ill-being and pollution to which such conditions often give rise. But this does not alter the fact that factory workers in regular employment have made great progress, particularly in their own self-esteem, and that this has been significantly due to the protection offered by the membership of a trade union. Conversely, self-esteem encourages them to organize themselves even when this is likely to arouse the displeasure of their bosses. As the National Commission on Labour concluded, the industrial worker of today has acquired a dignity not known to his predecessor, or as the employer saw it, a greater measure of defiance towards these superiors. The new assertiveness was based on a new awareness. A worker today is more politically conscious than before, more articulate of the existing order and more sensitive to his conditions and hardships. And it was the charismatic role models provided by the cadre members which induced the less active and less conscientized factory workers to assert themselves even if only temporarily. Ramasami's research illustrates this well. They describe in detail with the sketches of the individuals and their life histories and thoughts a world of the union activist, held together by an ideology of working class solidarity cutting across the barriers of the caste and employment. By their personal example, they carry along the mass of ordinary workers who are moderately apathetic about the wider issues but still loyal enough to strike, demonstrate and perhaps vote them when asked by those they respect. The union provides a service when needed. In return, it sometimes asks for sacrifice and enthusiasm. Wage increases have undoubtedly been the most urgent demand of the trade union movement since its inception. Its program of action soon broadened, however, into a more general protest against the hierarchical order not only of the industry but of the society as a whole. While that hierarchical instructed labor to resign itself to its own subordination, the ideology of the unions nurtured the principles of equality and social justice. Corruption of those ideals was linked to everyday party politics in which the unions were deeply embroiled and also resulted from contradictory currents that prevailed among the working masses, a great proportion of whom originated from a world that was by no means impervious to distinctiveness of caste, class, ethnicity, religion and gender. It is thus all the more significant that the main public ideology, not just the language of politics and unions, but much ordinary talks tend to stress moral and social equality. Assertion of dignity were also a denial of dependency and inequality and were met with the considerable oppression from the employers who attached great significance to the recognition of the own traditional authority and who quite rightly saw the industrial agitation as undermining their claim to the respect obedience. Consider the following appeal with which at the start of the 1950s one employer called his striking workers to order, "Your illegal and indisciplinary ways distress me. I am tired and will be compelled to take action. My advice to you as your elder and a well-wisher is work wholeheartedly and maintain discipline. If you do not follow my humble advice, you will compel the company to dismiss all those who act illegally, as we have waited patiently for long." 3 decades later, such language could have been greatly with utter hilarity. During the 1970s and 1980s, drastic changes took place in labor relations as a result of restructuring of the industrial economy. Rationalization of production became a major trend, first in private business but subsequently also in public sector enterprises, and resulted in significant downsizing. Between 1968 and 1984, the average number of production workers per factory declined from 75 to 61. Technological change played some role, but many more workers were placed by cheap casual labor than by machines. Exit policy in the guise of the voluntary retirement scheme reduced the size of the permanent workforce in both large and small companies. The efficiency drive met with the wholehearted approval of the state bureaucracy, which increasingly shared the employers' view that the maintenance of existing labor rights was a major obstacle to economic growth. The inevitable outcome of the flexibilization of the industrial work has been a contraction of production in the formal sector and further expansion of the informal sector economy. In this scaling down, the job security of the permanent workforce was nevertheless reaffirmed, and they may even have improved their bargaining position, suggesting a direct link between the privileges granted to a tiny section of the workforce and the marginalization of a much larger segment. But, however, this may be lower manning levels meant heavier workloads for those who remained. In return for higher wages, they had to commit themselves to higher production targets. These changes gave rise to a new type of trade union leadership exemplified by Datta Samant in Mumbai. The style of negotiation was confrontational, demands were immoderate, and legal niceties were ignored. The leader insisted on an united front and demanded total obedience, but also promised no compromises. Direct action had only one aim: monetary gain. The relationship between the leader and the worker is essential contractual and does not bind them beyond the duration of the strike. The union boss is more leader of a campaign than the head of an enduring organization. He neither bothers about the problems, complaints and the request of the individual workers, and nor he is deeply interested in his ideology issues or the working class movement at large. If the strike fails, he simply moves on to the next target, which may be a different industry. Before the start of any action, the financial standing of the company is carefully assessed in order to calculate the level at which the union's demands should be pitched. When the labor costs are not critical to the cost of production, management is much more eager to settle the dispute than in industries where wages are pegged at 1/4 or 1/3 of the manufacturing expense. The failure of the huge textile strike in 1982 and 83 in Mumbai, which lasted for 18 months and in which more than 2 lakh workers took part under the leadership of Datta Samant, should be seen in this light. The defeat certainly affected his reputation, but not only for a short time, but not in more capital intensive branches of industry. Aggressive leadership of this kind stands in marked contrast to the less militant and more legalistic leadership of the conventional unions. Mavericks like Datta Samant are accused of luring the workers away from the established leaders who best know how to take care of their real interest. They antagonize the employers and the land workers with deals which are bound to turn sour. But as several authors have argued, this representation does little justice to the sense of disillusionment and the resentment which many organized sector workers have developed towards their erstwhile representatives. The new combination of the working class radicalism and business like unionism is indicative of a new stage in industrial relations in which wider to narrower and more short-term interest. To dismiss much such behavior as apolitical would be a misread the assertiveness and self-consciousness of these militant workers whose social identity differs markedly from the older generation of the factory hands. The traditional stereotype of the industrial worker as an illiterate lower caste migrant pushed out of the village by the unemployment was dubious at the best of the times. Now, it is becoming more untrue with each passing day. Most enterprises in the organized sector would not consider for employment anyone without a school leaving certificate, and the presence of the graduates and the postgraduates in the blue collar workforce has long ceased to be a novelty. For a skilled trades, a technical diploma from an industrial training institute is an additional advantage. With wages so attractive and the employment so scarce, the blue collar workforce too became a polyglot mix of the workers from various caste and religious backgrounds. As for management's reaction to this new radicalism, much depends on their readiness to adjust to the new times. Some took offense at being addressed in a manner which did not acknowledge their authority and superiority. Others responded in a business like fashion and clinched deals which still gave them the upper hand. In exchange for an increase in the wage packet, they insisted on including clauses on heavier workloads, incentive schemes, and lower rates of absenteeism. It was not at all rare for the union, which had called a strike, to be held responsible for the workers' fulfillment of these conditions. By allowing the likes of Datta Samant to operate on their premises, the employers not only hoped to buy the industrial peace but also a more productive workforce. The other side of the story is, of course, that ever increasing benefits were placed in the hands of ever shrinking numbers. As Ramasamy has astutely noted, contract workers, casual labor, redundancy, and voluntary retirement scheme create the surplus that is passed on to those left behind in a permanent employment. The flow is from one segment of the workforce to another rather than from capital to labor. If not from the ideology, then at least from the self-interest, the unions will eventually have to organize the unorganized if they are to be left with the constituency at all. Employers who initially did not know how to cope with the phenomenon of the independent unions have grown to like them. What they want for their enterprise is not the representation, but several unions fighting with each other over the spoils, but a strong leader able to instill discipline among his clientele. The industrialist organization has consistently argued in favor of the one factory, one union principle. That preference is strongly inspired by the perception that plant level associations do not have a wider agenda and are wary of joining national federation which are hand in glove with political parties. This trend is also in line with the World Bank recommendations. In its 1995 annual report, negotiations at the plant level are prized as the most appropriate framework in which to achieve positive economic effects. Conclusion: employment in the organized sector of the urban economy, although absorbing only a minor portion of the total workforce outside agriculture, became the main focus of studies on the work and labor. According to a strongly held views, the quality of the labor left much to be desired, and this became a major argument in explaining the low productivity in industry. The Indian worker, rooted in traditional structure and culture, was blamed for the notion of gender was practically absent, the lack of commitment. The growth of India's industrial proletariat was by and large an urban phenomenon. The profile of the emerging workforce is discussed in terms of caste and class, skill formation and employment modalities. Trade unions were instrumental in raising wages, improving the working conditions and dignifying industrial work through the labor legislation. But again, This all reminded the prerogative of a small segment of the industrial workers who found a niche in the formal sector of economy. With this, we complete the unit Industry and Labour in our course Sociology of India. Thank you.